Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. While we've been distracted by the war in Ukraine, Pakistan has gone through a political upheaval. Imran Khan was removed as prime minister through a parliamentary vote of no confidence, which he blamed on a US-backed coup. Pakistan's elected leaders have never completed their terms, and some have been assassinated or executed or had their planes mysteriously crash. Khan was seen as an outsider who rose to fame as captain of the national cricket team, but couldn't lead his country as successfully. His celebrity didn't translate into efficient rule. As a longtime critic of the US war in Afghanistan and the US drone wars, he took a defiant stance against the EU and the West in general. In an unprecedented move, Pakistan's opposition parties, who are normally bitter rivals and at each other's throats, united to oust him. Khan was seen as improving relations with Russia, and was coincidentally in Moscow on the day the war in Ukraine started. The US has also been worried for many years about Pakistan's growing friendship with China. Pakistan's military, which is known as the umpire of Pakistani politics, was responsible for bringing him into power in what was regarded as a rigged election, seemingly because they thought he had a plan for governance. And then they turned against him, sealing his fate. With a population of over 220 million, Pakistan's relations with the US have been complicated. An ally in the war against the Soviets, then an ally in the war on terror, at the same time as it was widely known that Pakistan was an indispensable backer of the Taliban and a safe haven for the terrorists the US was trying to kill. So what happened and what can we expect? Here to explain it all is Taimur Rahman, a Pakistani Marxist, associate professor of political science at Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Secretary General of the Workers' and Peasants Party. Taimur, welcome.
Thank you, Rania. Great to be here and honored to be invited to your wonderful program.
Well, I'm very honored to have you on. And I guess, Taimur, before I ask you about the geopolitical and historical context of what took place in Pakistan, can you maybe explain to our listeners and viewer what has transpired in the last month? And then we can go from there.
Right. So about 3.5 years ago, as you correctly pointed out, the government of Imran Khan, or the party of Imran Khan, that's the party of justice, came to power, Tehreek-e-Insaf, and it won by a narrow margin of votes. It had only about 10 extra seats in the National Assembly, and the opposition needed to convert 10 seats from one side to the other side in order to bring forward a vote of no confidence. And they had been sort of planning this for the last 3.5 years, trying to break the coalition that Imran Khan had built in order to topple his government. And on February 11th, they announced that they had the necessary votes now, and that they would bring forward this vote of no confidence. And the insiders had already begun to speculate that, in fact, Imran Khan's allies had broken from him. And some of the allies actually went to meet with Nawaz Sharif, who was the former prime minister and the big leader of the second largest political party in Pakistan. In the midst of all of this, on 4th March, Imran Khan, I believe it was on 4th March, I could have the date wrong, he went to Russia and there met with Putin, and there was a deal struck for gas and oil and also for wheat. And in exchange for that, the Pakistani government for the first time abstained from voting in the United Nations General Assembly in a way that would favor the West, which of course caused somewhat of a diplomatic fracas between the EU first and Pakistan, as well as between the US and Pakistan. The EU ambassadors wrote a letter to Pakistan, which basically said, we urge Pakistan to vote with us on at the UN General Assembly. And then the one of the figures of the State Department said to Imran Khan, said to the ambassador of the government that we're very unhappy with the way in which Pakistan is voting on this particular issue, or has already voted on this particular issue. So the vote of no confidence now began to gain momentum. It was filed on the 8th of March. And once filed, the law states that the National Assembly can no longer be dissolved. It has to now go through once it's been filed. That's what the Constitution says, and that's what sort of the parliamentary system, allows for. Now, Imran was very worried. He ran around trying to cobble together a coalition. He didn't manage. And on the 27th, he announced that he would hold a very big Jalsa, which is a big march in the capital city. It was a huge march where he took out a piece of paper which said, which he said was a letter from the United States. And he said that the US is trying to overthrow my government. It's attempting regime change. Just 2 or 3 days before this massive jalsa, the chief of army staff came on television and in English stated the position of the army, or rather the Pakistan government, really, on Ukraine, which was very different from the position that Imran Khan had so far taken. And the position that Imran Khan had so far taken was not like that was done without the approval of the army. The army later did say that he went to Moscow with our input and our approval, etc. So now, on when the vote of no confidence came to motion in the National Assembly, Imran Khan had the deputy speaker dismiss the vote of no confidence on the grounds of Article 5 that the entire opposition was colluding with the United States of America. And therefore, the motion for the vote of no confidence was dismissed. Once it was dismissed, legally speaking, the president then ordered that the assemblies would be dissolved. That whole problem then went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you cannot dismiss the motion for vote of no confidence merely on the accusation that the entire opposition has colluded with the United States of America. You have to prove that.
Right.
And hence the dismissal of the vote of no confidence was illegal. The dissolving of the assemblies was illegal. The assembly then held its session on April 11th, and Imran Khan lost the majority in the National Assembly. 174 delegates, ministers of the National Assembly, voted for the opposition. And so now we have Mia Shehbaz Sharif as the new Prime Minister of Pakistan. The same thing has also happened in the Provincial Assembly of the Punjab just 2 days ago, where Imran Khan's government in Punjab also has now been replaced by the Muslim League Noon. So that's pretty much what's been going on. One very important thing that your viewers need to know, though, is that through these 3.5 years that Imran Khan has been in power, there has been double-digit inflation and rise in the cost of living in this entire period. And Pakistan is deeply, deeply in debt. We need anywhere between 12 to $14 billion a year in order to make up for our trade deficit. And we get about half of that from the IMF, about 6 billion, and we get another half of that from Saudi Arabia. Meaning, of course, that we have to toe the line as far as Saudi Arabia and Iran are concerned, and we have to continue to do what the IMF says with respect to structural adjustment policies and other things. So it was a major crisis, and the crisis continues even today because after Ukraine, the price of oil and gas has gone up by about enormously. And because of that, now Pakistani government even needs more money to stay afloat. It needs about $14 billion in order to stay afloat. So very deep crisis here, a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, as it were, which is exacerbating people's problems. And for the last 3.5 years, I can't tell you, given COVID, given everything that's happened with the lockdown, and given this incredible rise in cost of living, given unemployment, what poor people have suffered in the last 3-4 years, they have probably never suffered in the history of this country. It's been absolutely horrific.
Yeah, it's terrible. And of course, a lot of developing countries are having to contend with the rising costs of all of these things like fuel and grain, on top of years of inflation and economic devastation from COVID. And, from that was an excellent summary. So I just want to ask you, I guess, your opinion now, because that was pretty much just like straightforward analysis. Of course,
Right.
Khan is claiming that the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, which you mentioned, had warned Pakistan that U.S. ties would be harmed if he survived this no confidence vote. And he's blamed outside powers for threatening Pakistani sovereignty and democracy. And then at the same time, he has been blamed for this economic mismanagement, if you will, that you just discussed. And there was opposition, of course, to his foreign policy. So I guess, this claim of a coup, do you think there's any truth to this claim, or was this just normal Pakistani politics?
Right. So there are a couple of things that Imran Khan has certainly done, which have caused the relations between the United States of America and the Pakistani government to be strained. I wouldn't say they've broken. I wouldn't say the US is against the Pakistani government at any level, but they've been strained. One of the central reasons is that the CIA and the Pakistani government were in talks about a military base in Pakistan. But the Pakistani establishment, by which I mean, of course, the military, this was reported in the New York Times and reported in the Pakistani media, said that we'll let you build an American military base in Pakistan, provided that the airstrikes you do or the drone strikes that you do in Afghanistan are signed off by the Pakistani government or by the Pakistani army, really. Which means basically the army wanted that the strikes would occur against those terrorists that the army considered to be anti-Pakistan, but would preserve the TTA, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Afghanistan, which is allied very closely to the Pakistani establishment itself. The Americans did not agree to that, so there was that was a stalemate. Then later on, the Pakistani government simply denied that the American CIA or the American government had requested any kind of a military base in Pakistan. They did, and there were talks about it, but now today they deny that it ever occurred. So that was one of the first things that strained relations. Secondly, the letter by the European Union also strained relations because the letter, we've all read the letter. All the letter said was, we urge Pakistan to do X, Y, and Z. Now, I'm sure the European Union wrote the same letter to China and to India, etc. But those countries didn't sort of take that diplomatic letter and blow it out of proportion, which Khan did. Khan went into the public with that letter and said, yeah, we are not your slaves, X, Y, Z. Whereas all he had to do was say, thank you for your input, but we agree to disagree, which is what India frankly did do. But he, sort of being a very populist, right-wing populist kind of figure, tried to build up on that. And the third thing was, of course, what Khan did on the 27th, which was claim that the US was attempting regime change. Now, there's no doubt that the United States complained to Pakistan, maybe even strongly complained to Pakistan, maybe even bitterly complained to Pakistan that they were not taking the right position on Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia. But to make the argument which Imran Khan very openly made, that the Americans paid the opposition to give money to his allies, to turn the allies against him, is not entirely credible. It's not credible because there's been enormous mismanagement. And Imran Khan is a very sort of a populist, sort of if I were to give it a positive spin, say self-confident. If I were to give it a negative spin, I'd say a bit arrogant politician. He really wants to go it alone. So he really neglected his opposition. Sorry, he really neglected his coalition partners. I'll tell you how. For example, the NQM, which is one of his major coalition partners with 7 seats in the National Assembly, was it 5 or was it 7? I forget, but either 5 or 7. But one of his major coalition partners, nonetheless, made a deal with the Pakistan People's Party, which had to do with the internal politics of Sindh, where they operate. They operate mainly in Karachi and Hyderabad. And they really want control of those cities. That's more important to them than what's going on in Ukraine. And the opposition was able to say, okay, we will talk to you and we will make sure this happens. And the opposition was in a better position to make that happen because the opposition is in power in the province in which NQM operates. So you see, it's more complicated than that. The same thing happened with the Balochistan Awami Party. They don't care about foreign policy as much as they care about what's going on in Balochistan. And the opposition was able to, sort of cajole them and convince them and to jump over. In addition to that, there were about 20 MNAs from Imran Khan's own party, who are called the dissident PTI members, who also jumped ship. Now, why did they jump ship? Nobody really can strongly say. There's lots of claims that they were offered lots of money. It may be true. But why would it be the Americans who would do that? I mean, the opposition is rich enough to do that on its own and has been known to do that. So I don't think that this was some international conspiracy. But obviously, the opposition was trying to win over as many people as it could and for the last 3.5 years, they were doing it so that they could make the motion of, they could bring it forward. Then he also isolated the media because he, from himself, although the media was initially very supportive of him, but he had these draconian laws introduced into the media, and there were these certain campaigns that were launched against dissident media anchors who were constantly questioning him. So there was a big section of the media that had now turned against Imran Khan. He also angered the judiciary because he filed a presidential petition against Justice Faiz Issa, who was a Supreme Court judge. And that angered the entire superior judiciary because the man was innocent. And the motion was totally wrong. And now today, Imran Khan has himself admitted that he made a mistake by filing this motion against Justice Faiz Issa because he was actually innocent. And finally, he lost his biggest supporter. So you see, one by one, he sort of lost many of his supporters. And then finally, he lost his biggest supporter, which was the military establishment itself. The military establishment was very much in favor of Imran Khan, as you correctly pointed out in your introduction. He took forward a narrative in the 2018 election, which was very much in line with what the military at that time wanted, because the military at that time was in kind of contradiction with the government at that time, which became the opposition and is now the government once again. Uh, so how did he lose the military? He lost the military, I think, because number one, because of what he did with the EU letter. The biggest export market that the Pakistanis have is the European Union. So if the European Union says, okay, we're not happy with you and we're not going to offer you these most favored nation no, it's another thing that they offer, forget the exact term, but we're not going to offer you those concessions, etc. Then we'll be in a lot of economic trouble. Similarly, then he went and he blamed the US government again, which the American military doesn't like. And although the Pakistani military doesn't like, the Pakistani military was on board with Imran Khan visiting Russia. But when the fallout came from the US, when the complaints came from the US, why? Not for any ideological reasons, not because they understand anything about the Azov Brigade or because they care about Ukrainian nationalists,
Right.
fascists. None of that. It has nothing to do with it. It's just that they needed oil. And so the military was in line with this idea that maybe we can get oil and gas from Russia, and that will ease our problems. But when the sort of blowback came from the US, then the military sort of left Imran Khan out to hang. You know what I mean?
Right.
They sort of said, I think they sort of said to Khan Saab, Khan Saab, we've got to back off now because the Americans are not happy. The Pakistani military is never going to want to get into a situation where their relations with the American government are strained.
Right.
Yeah, they'll negotiate up to a certain point, as happens often in politics, but not beyond a certain point. And they obviously felt that red line they were reaching that red line, and they wanted to back off. And Imran Khan was being, sort of populist and so on, and really was very scared of the vote of no confidence. So he thought he could maybe utilize this to, he could capitalize on this and say this is a conspiracy. Now, he's failed to prove that this was an instance of regime change. We've seen regime change in many countries. We've seen what we call the color revolutions and so on, right? And we've seen how the Western media the entire media sort of drives that campaign, and the government and the media and everybody and academics even get on board with it, etc. Right. And we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that in the case of Pakistan. We haven't seen any, open condemnation. So I think that the claim that the Americans attempted first of all, there is no coup because clearly this was a constitutional procedure by the book, the book. That's very clear. And in fact, there are signs that Imran Khan wasn't actually wanting to undertake a military coup against the National Assembly. So when the Supreme Court decided that the National Assembly could not be dissolved and that the vote of no confidence would be held, on the day that the vote of no confidence was being held, it was supposed to be held at 10:30 in the morning. And till 11 o'clock at night, there was no vote of no confidence. The speaker just wasn't doing it. And that at 11:30 at night, the speaker finally resigned. And then the deputy speaker resigned, and then the speaker took over and the vote of no confidence proceeded. Now, what was going on the whole day, BBC reported, and The Guardian also reported, that in fact what was going on the entire day was that Imran Khan was sitting in the Prime Minister house with his cabinet and was trying to get the military now to dissolve parliament and hold elections. And the BBC report, which is denied by the military and also denied by Imran Khan, states, in fact, that the chief of army staff arrived at the prime minister's house and forced Imran Khan to back off and said, basically, we're not dissolving the assembly. We're not going to impose martial law and dissolve the assembly and call elections. So it appears that there was it could have been a coup on the other side as well on behalf of Imran Khan. He was trying to. The rumor mill says that he was trying to bring to power General Faiz, replace General Bajwa, who's the top guy, bring General Faiz to the top, and then dissolve the assembly and rehold the elections. Basically, that's what he wants. He wants to rehold the elections. So yeah, exciting stuff in Pakistani politics, complex stuff, not as simplistic and not as simple as Imran Khan has made it out to be, and I think much of the sort of press in the West has picked up on that and sort of debated it on those grounds. But the situation, I think, it's fair to say that it's fairly more complicated than that, with lots of regional interests and other things going on in the background, etc.
Exactly. Yeah, it sounds very local, but of course, there's always the overarching theme of so many people in the establishment, of course, working for local interests, but always in the back of their minds, it's like, well, we can't upset the US. So that alone, the fact that so many people in other countries have to have US interests on the top of their agenda alone is like a constant violation of sovereignty. But of course, yeah, the term coup doesn't seem to really apply here and does seem
Yeah.
to be quite self-serving. I wanted to ask you though about someone you
Can I
mentioned.
make a point quickly
Of
on what
course.
you just said?
Mm.
Now, till the 27th of March, it was basically only Imran Khan's inner circle and maybe a few other politicians who, in his inner circle mainly, who knew about this diplomatic exchange between Donald Blue and the ambassador of Pakistan. Nobody in the general public knew anything about it. So, but the vote of no confidence, as I said, was already planned from February 11th. So that's a long time back. So, but I will say this in favor of what you're saying. So this is one argument that goes against the idea that it was this particular thing that broke the camel's back, this particular straw. But on the other hand, what is very interesting to note is that the chief of army staff came on Pakistan television, and in English, not in Urdu, in English, which whenever somebody comes and speaks in English in Pakistani media, it means that they're talking to people outside. It means that they're not talking to our own people, right? So and to the upper class of Pakistan. So in English, he basically said that the foreign policy of Pakistan will be, not in so many words, but pretty much that, will be aligned with the United States of America in condemning Russia. Now, that was totally opposite to what Imran Khan had been saying and the way in which Pakistan had been voting at the UNGA. So that was a very clear signal, not that America was XYZ, but that the Pakistan military certainly was, hinting that we are not, that Imran Khan is a bit of a liability for us.
Right.
Because he's just, we can't control this guy because he's just all over the place, and we want to stay within the framework of supporting the United States of America. So that is very clear. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's on record. Anybody can see that Imran Khan was arguing for a non-aligned position on Ukraine, and the military very clearly argued the position for an alignment. And that, saying that just 2 or 3 days before the vote of no confidence, meant, of course, that the opposition got the signal. That the opposition said, Imran Khan has lost the support of the military. That is a clear sign that now we can go for the kill. Now he's down. It's over for him. And so if there was a small trickle of people that were supporting the opposition before, after General Bajwa's statement, you can be assured that that trickle turned into a certain victory for the opposition after that.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about the person who's replaced Khan, which is this guy, Shehbaz. Is that how you say it? Shehbaz Sharif, who's
That's
the
absolutely
brother,
right, yes.
who's the brother of a former prime minister and representing one of the sort of two family dynasties who dominate Pakistani politics. The other being, of course, the Bhuttos. And he was chief minister of Punjab, where he was praised for his work on development and social issues. And of course, two of the Sharif children are also important politicians. So what can you tell us about Shehbaz specifically and the Sharifs more generally?
Well, the Sharifs really rose to prominence in Pakistani politics in the 1980s when they were very closely aligned with the dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq, which was a very right-wing Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship allied at that time with the United States of America. And they made their name in fighting the left in Pakistan at that time, the trade unions, the working class movement, the People's Party, which was at that time quite left of center. It no longer is, but at that time it was. So they made their name as essentially right-wing politicians, and then as pro-business and right-wing politicians. And then in the in the late 90s, there was a particular kind of situation where, out of economic necessity, the Sharifs began to try and turn the tide on a very important foreign policy framework within Pakistan. Our foreign policy has pretty much been dominated in two respects. One, it's always been favorable to the US. The other, it's always been opposed to India. Now, that opposition to India was economically very damaging to Pakistan because India is a huge market. It's right next door. So, being businessmen, the Sharifs thought, well, why not make a peace with India? And we'll have access to a big market. We'll have access to cheaper commodities and so on and so forth. So they began to move in that direction. That angered the military establishment, and their government was unraveled. Then after that, we had a long period of General Musharraf's military dictatorship, which was also allied to the US, and so on. And they were in exile. But then they also, you could say, developed an anti-military stance, anti-dictatorship stance, although they themselves were products of a period in which they supported military dictatorship. But now they also turned against military dictatorship. And they supported this movement called the Lawyers Movement, which was a very important movement that finally brought down the dictatorship of General Musharraf. And it was at that time that Benazir was assassinated, and they didn't come to power. The People's Party came to power. They played the role of a constitutional opposition, no longer, inviting the military to step in and overthrow the government as they had done in the past. Now they decided we're going to stay within the framework of the constitution. We're not going to invite the military to dissolve the assemblies, but we'll fight the People's Party. So they did that. Then they came back into power. Of course, by this time, the policies of the People's Party or of Musharraf or of the Muslim League or of Imran Khan, all of the parties that have been in or out of power, all their economic policies have pretty much been identical. They've been policies that have been designed by the International Monetary Fund, and they've been neoliberal capitalist policies. Anyway, they came back into power, and then they got into trouble with the military again. This time, Imran Khan really sort of gained popularity by attacking the government of Nawaz Sharif as being corrupt. He was dismissed on corruption charges, although the level of corruption that they were able to show was rather petty and minor. They weren't able to show that he had embezzled crores of rupees, although of course he has, but he's smart. He knows how to embezzle without getting caught. They all are. Yeah. After being in power for so many decades, you can be sure that they know how to do this much better. So anyway, Imran Khan came to power and he promised, I'm going to prosecute these people. I'm going to put them in prison. I'm going to show their corruption. I'm going to bring all the stolen money back. And of course, he wasn't able to do it because all the stolen money is already in foreign banks, and no foreign bank is going to return that money. And also, it's actually very difficult to prove these corruption cases. It's easier to make an accusation than to prove it because it's moved through various loopholes in the legal framework such that it's, it's legitimate. So he wasn't really able to deliver on his promises. I think he really did want at one point, A, not to go to the IMF, B, to create some sort of a welfare state along Islamic principles, C, to prosecute all of the other parties. And in all these fronts, he pretty much failed to do that. And for that reason, I think he began to lose some of his popular support.
And then, I think it's really important how you mentioned that Pakistan is sort of like, is sort of shackled by the strict terms of these IMF loans in the sense that, that it's like you can't get out of them and you have to constantly, it's almost impossible. Like you have to constantly look to you have to constantly look to your relationship with the United States. And it makes perfect sense. And now this guy who's back is also tied closely to Western financial institutions. It'll add probably in the eyes of a lot of elites some sort of sense of stability for Pakistan. But I'm curious, this is a very big question. Probably isn't one response to it, but why don't prime ministers ever complete their terms in Pakistan, or at least elected leaders?
What a great question. What a great question. Well, the reason is that the civil military bureaucracy is far stronger than any political party in Pakistan. And it's really been either the bureaucracy. In the 50s, it was mainly the bureaucracy that would get rid of prime ministers like that. They were in the first 7 years, we had like 11 prime ministers or something
Wow.
ridiculous like that. Yeah. And then a president. Then we had a presidential system for a while. Then we had a very legitimate, popular sort of prime minister by the name of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was left of center, and he was overthrown by the military, and then he was hanged. And then in the 80s, we had another prime minister, the right-wing prime minister, Junejo, pro-military. But then he started questioning something about the jihad, etc., and where the money was going. So he had to be he was gotten rid of. And by that time, Zia brought this ordinance called an amendment to the constitution called the Eighth Amendment, which allowed the president to dismiss parliament and to dismiss the prime minister. So every time the prime minister got too big for his boots, the military establishment would get their man, who was the president, to dismiss the government. So and then after that, then the opposition parties got together, got rid of that amendment, but still continued to fight against each other. And every government that is formed has been a weak coalition government. So after a few years, it becomes possible for the opposition to break the coalition partners and to bring a new prime minister. So that's happened several times. Also, you have corruption charges, etc., etc. So the parties themselves sometimes also decide, okay, we'll get rid of the PM, we'll bring another PM, and that'll solve the problem. So that's pretty much what's been going on. Being the PM is the hardest job in Pakistan. Let me tell you, it's the most thankless job in Pakistan because you have all the blame without any of the real power. So it's not an enviable. And if anything goes wrong, you're the one who's going to get blamed, and you're going to be finished very quickly.
Yeah.
If you really want power in Pakistan, it's better to be chief of army staff. That's a much better career path than to be prime minister.
Some good advice for any of those viewers or listeners out there who are thinking of prime minister of Pakistan as a career path. It's something to think about. But, so in that respect, it sounds like the military apparatus really is in control. So then in that case, why can't civilians control the military in Pakistan?
Well, it all has to do with the political parties themselves. The political parties in Pakistan tend to be dominated by these very large capitalist and landed families, and it's very, very difficult for the middle class or for the working class to develop an independent political party on the scale of Pakistan itself, which is a huge country. Now they develop them in certain towns and regions and cities, etc. And they'll develop them in certain regions, and they're important players, but they don't become national players. And I think one of the key things to develop yourself at the national level has always been that you've got to have the main parties that have managed to develop at that scale have been parties or figures that at one time or another played ball with the military. So the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto also at one time was the foreign minister of General Ayub. So a big name in politics, right? And then you had the Sharifs, who were lifted by Ziaul Haq. They became big name in politics. And similarly, it is argued that Imran Khan were already a big name as a cricketer and as a celebrity and as a philanthropist, was able to utilize his celebrity status to and work with the military to get votes. So the main argument, of course, is that the civil military apparatus very subtly supports certain politicians, certain kinds of politicians within a certain narrative. And it's very difficult to break that master narrative and to bring other political parties into the mainstream at that level, because it's a huge country. The resources, the outreach that you would require to do that would be really quite large, would really be quite massive. And very few parties like our party or working class or middle class parties, etc., are able to really get our word out at that same scale. Like Imran Khan, when he was in opposition, began to protest against the government, and he went on protest for 127 days. And for 127 days, the entire media of Pakistan used to give him coverage for 4 hours a day.
Wow.
I would
love that. I would love that for a leftist party. Get 4 hours
Rania,
of coverage a day.
Rania, if you had that in the United States of America, I can guarantee that you would beat Joe Biden and be the president of that country.
Possibly, right? If they gave us 4 hours a day
Absolutely.
to like talk about inequality and capitalism, for sure.
Absolutely. On all the channels. Imagine on
Wow.
all the channels. Fox News, CNN,
Right.
CBS, everybody's covering you. So that's the kind of coverage that, these sort of big names are able to together. And and so the media also, like Chomsky says, and you often also say, self-selects.
Right.
They're not going to have Rania Khalek, on Fox News, or maybe once or twice, but that's about it, right?
Yeah.
So they self-select. They say, well, these are legit people. We can talk to these people. These are crazy people. We can't talk to these people, or they're irrelevant. They'll say they're irrelevant, So that's how it's also the political economy of media, the political
Right.
economy of electoral politics, big money. All of that plays a role, as it does anywhere else in the world.
Of course. And I wanted to ask you about the role of Punjab province because it seems to be
Right.
so dominant. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm just thinking like if that was the case in the US, if like there was a state in the US that was just like completely dominated politics, there would be extreme grievances across the rest of the country. In fact, in some
Right.
ways there are. So I'm curious,
Yes.
why is Punjab province so dominant in Pakistan? And does that create grievances in other parts of the country?
Well, the main reason for its dominance is firstly the fact that it's the largest in terms of its population, not in terms of of the land, and it has about 55% of the population of Pakistan. And the second reason is that it has 5 rivers that go through it, which is why it's called Punjab. Punj means 5. Ab means water, so land of 5 waters. So it's the agricultural heartland of the whole of Pakistan. So it's always had an edge over other areas because in terms of agriculture, because of water resources. And then because it had that edge, the British developed canals here and developed canal colonies and developed railways and so on, and developed an infrastructure here. And then thirdly, the recruitment for the military, the British military after 1857 in particular, there was a lot of recruitment from the Punjab because the Punjabi peasant was considered to be very loyal to the British army for various reasons, historical reasons. So for that reason, the Punjab tends to be richer, numerically it's larger, and tends to dominate in the lower ranks of the military. Not necessarily so much in the upper ranks, but certainly in the lower ranks of the military is full of Punjabis. So for that reason, there's enormous resentment in the other 3 provinces, even in Kashmir, against Punjab. And they really do feel that Punjab is like an imperialist country
Oh.
in their countries. Yeah, they use that term. They say it's an imperialist power against us, and we want freedom from the Pakistan army and from the Punjab.
I want to move to sort of like bigger picture geopolitical issues related to Pakistan. I'm curious, maybe we could start with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Taimur, what can you tell us about the role of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries when it comes to Pakistan?
Well, you'll have to say that I'm the exception here because most Pakistanis think the role of Saudi Arabia has been absolutely fantastic.
Oh,
They've given,
yikes.
yeah, well, it's a religious thing really because because of the reverence that Pakistanis have for Makkah and Medina and and for the Holy Land, etc. But the role that Saudi Arabia has played in Pakistan, in my view, has been one in which it has promoted a particular brand of Islam, which has during the Cold War, which was very reactionary, very right wing, very extremely narrow minded, which of course gave rise to religious fundamentalism. Eventually led to the creation of things like the Taliban, etc. It really, I think, the entire madrasa network in Pakistan owes itself in a very major way to Saudi funding and financing, and the rise of right-wing political parties have, Saudi funding and financing has played a huge role, and that, of course, has had a very negative impact on the development of Pakistani political and cultural consciousness and intellectual consciousness. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Pakistan was much like any other Muslim country. You could say a bit like Lebanon, perhaps even, where in Lebanon you had Jubilat, etc., Kamal Jubilat, and sort of major left-wing Lebanese national movement, etc. So in Pakistan also you had Islamic and Muslim modernists and very big left-wing movements like the Awami League in East Pakistan and the People's Party in West Pakistan and the National Awami Party and so on. And socialism was huge. It was on the agenda. It was on the mainstream agenda in Pakistan. There was a lot of support in Pakistan, for example, for Gamal Abdul Nasser, who was considered a great hero of the Muslim world at that time. In fact,
Right.
Bhutto liked to model himself on Nasser. He thought he was the Nasser of Pakistan. There was a lot of support similarly for Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi. There's a stadium here in Lahore called Gaddafi Stadium. It's still called Gaddafi Stadium, yeah, because Colonel Gaddafi sent the money to help build that wonderful stadium, and all the cricket matches still occur there. And Gaddafi was, was the Che Guevara of the of Pakistan for Pakistani women. He was considered very good-looking, very charismatic, etc. Yeah, this is my mother and her generation thought Gaddafi was just amazing. Um, so um, so there was a lot of this was very much part of the Pakistan at that time was very much part of this wave of pan-Arab socialism which was sweeping across the Middle East. And then of course there was a significant support in the 50s for Mossadegh of Iran, etc. So this was the milieu, this was the sort of the thought processes that were going on in Pakistan at the time. And this carried on till I'd say the late 1970s. And then we had a coup, which was backed by the United States of America. We had an 11-year dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq, which was backed by Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, while it was working on the one hand to undermine the free officers movement and the Nasserite socialists, etc., in the Middle East, at the same time was allied with Ziaul Haq in Pakistan. Um, and the same thing was happening here. And here, of course, the whole effort was to destroy the communist government in Afghanistan. So that was a huge, huge project in which the Americans poured in, I don't know, billions of dollars, and the Saudis poured in billions of dollars. And the total aid to these forces went something to the tune of $40 billion. We don't even know the exact figures. I mean, it was
Right.
massive. It was massive. And it really completely transformed Pakistan. I mean, it really tilted the natural, spontaneous development of Pakistan, intellectual development of Pakistan, was completely now transformed by Saudi petrodollars and American aid, etc., pushing Pakistan into this reactionary Salafi, extremist sort of framework. All of this was done during the Cold War. All of this was backed by the United States of America, by United Kingdom, by France, even backed by Israel. They also sent arms to help the Mujahideen, etc. All of that is now public knowledge. So it really transformed, it destroyed the left in Pakistan. First of all, it completely obliterated the left in Pakistan eventually. Not immediately, but over time.
Yeah.
The left was considered now to be anti-Islam, anti-state, just something you could not touch. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was considered to be a complete, failure. All of these things. The right wing completely dominated. Rania, I like to put it this way for Western viewers. I think they'll be able to understand where I'm coming from if I put it in this historical framework. Imagine, if you will, that in the Second World War, the USSR had lost the war and Nazi Germany had won the war. Imagine if fascism and Nazism had come to dominate over Europe or continue to dominate over Europe as it had come to dominate in the 1930s. What would Europe look like if Nazism had won the Second World War? It would be a very different Europe, wouldn't it? It would be a very different world. It
Yeah.
would be a completely different. So now just imagine that that's exactly what happened in Pakistan. The counter revolution won. The Nazis won. The fascists won. The religious fundamentalists won. They crushed the revolution in Afghanistan. They crushed the left in Pakistan. We lost. Let's put it straightforwardly. We don't ever like to say we've lost. But if you put it straightforwardly, the right wing won. The fascists won. We lost. And now we're trying to, how should we say, put ourselves back together with great difficulty against an enemy that's 100 times, 1,000, 1,000,000 times stronger. And in the mainstream politics of Pakistan, all you see are one group of right-wing people fighting another group of right-wing people.
Sounds kind of like the world today, but a more extreme version of it. Like
In
in
yeah,
general, yeah. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
That's
Europe
that's
still has
actually
some of what
go ahead,
Europe
go
still
ahead.
has a somewhat of a left-wing tradition. Still has a vibrant left-wing intelligentsia. In
Right.
Pakistan, that's destroyed. That was destroyed completely. So look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan was once a country that was, modernizing. It was changing. It was transforming. Today's Afghanistan, you cannot even recognize the country if you compare it to what was going on in the 70s in Afghanistan or what was going on in the 80s. It looks like a completely different country. So
Right.
Pakistan is not that bad, but it's close enough. It's completely gone backwards in a certain way. So Imran Khan is a right of center politician. Shehbaz Sharif is a right of center politician. Musharraf was a right of center politician. People's Party tries to be a little bit left of center, but the overall, it's like the Democratic Party, maybe. The overall framework of Pakistan, the overall
Sounds
framework of,
awful.
yeah, in the sense that it on social issues, the People's Party takes very good
Right.
positions. On women's rights, on minorities, you can always count on them that they will take the right position on those things, with few exceptions here and there. But on the whole, the party will, stand by those principles. But on the economic question, they will not take any position which we would today characterize as being left of center. On the economic question, they're very much the same. They'll agree with IMF, etc. Follow through on all of that. Although they are also part of the Socialist International, the Second International.
Yeah.
They're still part of that, but I mean,
Interesting.
yeah, it's a defunct international now. I mean, they hardly play any role that international. So that's where we're at. It's a
Yeah.
very tough situation. And now people say to us, for example, why don't you ally with Imran Khan against Shehbaz Sharif? Or why don't you ally with Shehbaz Sharif against Imran Khan? That's a very difficult position for us to take. It's very, very awkward for us to take that position because the constituency to which we appeal would not be very happy if we began to support Imran Khan, given his track record on media freedoms, his track record with respect to trade union movements, working class movements, women's issues, the feminist movement, minorities, XYZ, the whole gambit, and the main thing, which is the economic question. And similarly with Shehbaz Sharif, how can we ally with him when given the track record that he has on
Right.
this is big business we're talking about. This is
Yeah.
the party of big business that we're talking
It's
about.
like,
So
should we
every time
pick
we make a
Bill, it's like picking between Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. It's like
exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. And Elon Musk really is Imran Khan, and Imran Khan is Elon Musk. You could not have said it better.
That's actually
Both of
funny.
them suffer from a acute narcissistic personality disorder and think
Right.
that they are entitled to owning the world, and are right-wing populists. Although Imran nearly doesn't have enough money as Elon Musk, but
He can't
um,
fly to Mars.
no, he can't fly for Mars. But they're
um,
very similar in many ways.
Well, so like on that, related tangentially related to that, you mentioned a sort of, Pakistan becoming increasingly conservative since the 1980s, and of course, it has its own Taliban problem as a result, as well as this kind of general problem with extremism. And also, I wanted to just raise like with the killing of Shias, for example. This was
Yes.
actually a common occurrence in Pakistan before we had the Sunni Shia conflicts that arose in the Arab world. Of course, also due to many similar reasons, by the way. I'm curious, what do you attribute the rise of that sort of Sunni extremism in the last 4 decades? Would you also sort of point the finger at the Saudi influence in this respect?
Yeah, it was the jihad. It
Mm,
was the Afghan jihad that gave rise to these extremist organizations. And, the schools of thought to which they belong, which is the Deobandi school of thought, or which is the main school of thought from which the jihadis were recruited, is if you pick up their older texts from the 19th century, from the 19th century onwards till the 20th century, they have considered the Shia to be essentially outside the pale of Islam. Similarly, with the great Imams of the Barelvi school of thought, which is the other major school of thought in Pakistan, they equally have thought of the Shias as being outside of the pale of Islam. So when the jihadi project started, these are the people that they recruited from. And as they became stronger, they began to read the texts that were, that were around, and that are blatantly very, very anti-Shiite. And it was inevitably going to give rise to this kind of sectarian violence. In my view, actually, I would say that the project of Islamization anywhere in the world, will always give rise to extreme forms of sectarianism. Right. That is the biggest, Achilles heel of any Islamic project, that it inevitably gives rise to, especially in our part of the world, it inevitably gives rise to deep divisions that go back 1400 years. Right. Can't really fight those. They're very deep. And then there were other factors as well, like, for example, certain areas of Pakistan where it was very easy to get people to fight with each other. Jhang is one such area. Certain areas of Balochistan where the Hazaras were targeted. So, and they're all Shiite. So you see Hazara, you say, oh, he's a Shiite. You can physically, in other parts of Pakistan, you can't physically differentiate a Sunni from a Shia, but there you can. So they were getting slaughtered. Then Parachanar, there's a very big Shiite community. They were getting slaughtered, etc. Horrible, just absolutely horrible. And it started in the 1980s under General Ziaul Haq. It had already begun back then.
Wow, it's been going on for quite some time. And sometimes I wonder to myself, this is more just me like commenting, but I wonder to myself, like, why is it that Latin America in the last 20 or 30 years has had the rise of so many leftist movements, whereas like West Asia hasn't, and the rest of that just hasn't managed to have those same kinds of movements that existed, 50 years ago. And I think you're absolutely right in the sense of the sort of weaponization of religious extremism by America, by Saudi Arabia, etc. I wanted to ask you though, what can you tell us, despite, of course, like the local right-wing dynamics of Pakistani politics, Pakistan does have this close relationship and increasingly close relationship with China that the US is very unhappy about. So what can you tell us about Pakistan's relationship with China?
That's a very solid relationship that is unlikely to break down at all. That relationship goes all the way back to the mid-1960s. And that has to do with the fact that Pakistan is mainly threatened. It faces its main existential threat, not from the US or any other part of the world, but from India. Pakistan really feels, the Pakistani ruling class and establishment really feels that it's at some point Pakistan may gravitate back into India. And the Indian ruling class really feels that at some point Pakistan ought to gravitate back into India. So the main the main national identity of Pakistan is constructed as being that which is not Indian. Although, if you're talking to me, I'm sure you won't be able to really recognize whether I'm Indian or Pakistani. People outside will say, I can't really tell. Is he Indian? Is he Pakistani? And they all sound the same to us, which is true. We do sound the same because we speak roughly the same language. We have the same jokes. We have the same sense of humor. We sing the same songs. We have the same cultural traditions in North India, etc. So it's quite true. I mean, we need to differentiate ourselves from India precisely because we are so much like India that we have to really say we are not like them. We have to point out all the ways in which we're not like them because we are actually so much like them. So in order to balance, now India is 10 times bigger. There's a military that's 11 times bigger. It's huge. It's a massive country. In comparison to that, Pakistan is a tiny country. So to balance India, after India and China went to war in 1962, the Pakistani government became very interested in making friends with China in order to balance off India. So that's what happened basically after the Sino-Indian border clash. The Pakistani military reached out to China, became friends with China. In fact, in the 60s, when Kissinger secretly visited China, it was through Pakistan that Henry Kissinger visited China. He first came to Pakistan, then took a secret trip to China in the mid-1960s and came back. And the United States actually knows this about Pakistan. So I've been watching some of the foreign press, which has been saying that the US is very concerned about Pakistan's close ties with China. But I can assure you this is not the case because Pakistan's close ties with China go a really long way back. And I think United States is very much pretty much understood that this is not a relationship that we can easily break.
Yeah.
They can maybe influence it a little bit, but they're not going to manage to break it because of the regional importance that China has to Pakistan vis-a-vis India. And so while this particular thing that happened with Imran Khan, much of the press has been saying that it has to do with close ties between Pakistan and Moscow and close ties between Pakistan and China. I'd say while the latter is true, close ties with Moscow did play some role in the US saying we're not very happy with this whole situation. Uh, but close ties with China, I think the US understands that that's not a relationship that can really they can really at this point alter in any way. They're not too worried about that though, because Pakistan, while being allied with China, also remains allied with the United States of America on all main foreign policy concerns. It doesn't vote with China, let's say, on important questions. It votes for the US as far as the UNGA is concerned, and it pretty much accepts whatever hegemonic project is coming its way, whatever the
Right.
position China takes. The Pakistani government continues in that. It doesn't really discuss with China. And the Chinese themselves also are hands off in this regard. They don't really press Pakistan as far as the foreign policy is concerned. So China is now investing something to the tune of $62 billion into Pakistan. It's already begun investing it. And then, there were some
That's a lot of
problems and
money.
now it's a lot of money. And so there is absolutely the military establishment is completely on board with this. The security for all the Pakistan Chinese projects in Pakistan is provided by the Pakistan military itself. And in the speech in which General Bajwa contradicted Imran Khan by saying that we will support the West as far as Ukraine is concerned, in the very same speech, he said, we want to have very good relations with the United States of America. We've always had good relations with them, and we will continue to have good relations with them. At the same time, he said, we've always had good relations with China, and we will continue to have good relations with China. These are our two most important strategic partners, and we will not risk our relationship with them under any circumstance.
I see.
And that's the key. So a relationship between Pakistan and China is not upsetting the United States of America. That's something they're reconciled to. They understand that that is something Pakistan will not, we can't shake them on this. And but it's not a problem for the US because though that relationship exists, it exists in relation to India. It doesn't exist in relationship to the USA.
Right.
An
It's a ruling class.
interesting complexity.
Yeah, it's a ruling class consensus. And of course, I think you're right, especially when you point out that it's more the US media that raises this as an issue. I'm specifically remembering when Imran Khan did a sit down interview. I think it was like with CBS or something, and they grilled him about Xinjiang, and he was like refusing to condemn China. And it was the media
Yeah.
that was incredibly upset about that. But you actually didn't hear
Yeah.
anything from American officials one way or another. So
That's right.
you
That's
make
right.
a very
Yeah,
good point.
the media, of course, was trying to get as many people on board with that narrative as possible. And the media was quite shocked when most of the Muslim world didn't go along.
They were like,
I mean, it was in
"What?"
fact,
Yeah.
yeah, in fact, it was most of the Muslim world that actually said, nothing, we're with China. We're not with you on this one, which was
Yeah.
quite unique and quite, interesting.
Yeah, it was.
And same with Imran Khan. Again, it's not out of any ideological reason. It's not because Pakistan has become pro-communist or anything. It has to do with regional interests. The relationship to balance India is very, very important. And now, of course, there's also money coming in. So they're not going to risk that under any circumstance at all.
Makes sense. That makes sense. That said, we see this kind of, I don't know if I'd call it like a growing power, maybe a shift in the global power dynamic that we've seen, especially following the war in Ukraine, where Russia and China are forming a closer bond as a result of sort of isolation from the West, even though they don't really like each other that much. Um, do you think that and this is more of like the sort of multipolarity question that I'm going towards here, but can Russia and China becoming more powerful countries as far as the sort of like world politics is concerned, can that help Pakistan end its dependence on the West? Does it, but at the same time, does it even make sense that you could ever see Pakistan turn their backs to the West and turn towards China and Russia, if that future does actually start to take place, where we see those kinds of polls emerging, which we kind of do?
Absolutely. I think, firstly, I'd say that it gives the entire third world, um, a bargaining chip. It gives them options. It puts more options on the table, and that's absolutely wonderful. We can use more options. During the Cold War, for example, if we weren't too happy with the United, I speak as on as sort of, if the third world wasn't too happy with what the U.S. had to offer, they would go to the Soviet Union. And once they went to the Soviet Union, the US had to change its offer. It had to offer something much better. I mean, that's what happened with Egypt, for example. It happened in the instance of many other countries in the Middle East, etc. And often, even countries that were very much aligned with the US, such as Pakistan, would sometimes just sort of deliberately sort of send signals that we're going to go and talk to the Soviet Union so that they could maybe get a better deal from the United States of America. So it gave them it gave them negotiating power, it gave them serious bargaining options. Russia and China are going to come closer and closer together. Now they have really strong economic reasons for doing so. China needs more and more oil. It's a growing industrial power. Russia, unfortunately, after the break of the Soviet Union, has nothing but oil and gas to sell. That's its main export commodity now, and it can sell that to China very easily. They're right next to each other, so that's a match that's going to be very strong now, because the interests align very, very strongly. And I think China sort of hedged a little bit on Ukraine, in the sense that they didn't sort of all out go and support Russia, but you could see that they're very strong. They are aligned with Russia in this regard. So that bloc is inevitably going to emerge. Maybe India may also be part of that. Brazil may also be part of that. Venezuela and many other countries may also choose to be part of that, depending on what happens to their political governments, etc.
Ideological rainbow.
Right, yes. Right, yes. Iran may very well want to be part of that. So there'll be a rainbow coalition there. And that's not a bad thing, because the world could use a little more of multipolarity, simply because one hegemon is just not a good idea at all. Because having one hegemon means that they get to do anything they want to, and there are no other options on the table at all. So I think that's a really positive thing. As far as the second question is concerned, Pakistan's links to the West are very, very strong, and that has to do with 100, 200 years of colonial rule. We don't speak Russian. We don't speak Chinese. We speak English. The upper class we have a huge educational system that educates people. All higher education in Pakistan is in English. People go abroad to study. So those are links that are not just economic now. They are cultural. They are embedded. They are intellectual. They're very, very deep links between the ruling class of Pakistan and the West as a whole. I'm not just talking about the US, but the West as a whole. The English-speaking world, to put it, let me put it that way. That link is very, very strong. I don't think that link will break so easily unless there's a huge shift in Pakistan's class structure itself. Then it could break. But given the class structure currently, I don't think the ruling class will, links that have been accumulated and developed over the last 200 years, I don't think they'll want to break those so easily. But they will want to utilize whatever advantages they can get from China and even from Russia. Now, let me give you one example. Pakistan is once again in a lot of trouble. I mean, if Imran Khan's government was overthrown because of his position on Ukraine, because of the oil deal that he made with Russia, let me tell you, the similar pressure exists for the Pakistani government today. Today, the price of oil is even higher than it was when Imran Khan went to meet with Putin. It's
Right.
I don't know the exact number, but it's if it was $3, now it's at $13 or $12 or $14. I forget the exact amount. It's enormously higher today than it was back then. And Pakistan cannot do without oil. There are 27 power stations in Pakistan that are closed down because we don't have oil to give them. 27 power stations.
You guys have blackouts? Do you have rolling blackouts?
There are areas of Pakistan with rolling blackouts. in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, rural areas where there's no electricity right now.
Wow.
One area in particular is where our party actually is in power. It's called Tangi, where we won the mayor's election. There's no electricity there at all. It's horrific. I mean,
That's
24
awful.
hours there's no electricity there. And you can imagine what that's going to do. So now the pressure on the Shehbaz government is you've got to get rid of whatever subsidies are there existed, and you've got to raise the price of fuel and gas. Inflation in Pakistan is already at 13%. If he raises the prices of fuel and gas, Rania, it's going to hit 20%. It's going to hit
Yeah.
25%. It's going to be devastating. And he's scared. I mean, he is terrified. He's going back to the IMF. He's saying, please renegotiate with me. Otherwise, my
Right.
government will fall. Please renegotiate the debt with me. I need money to buy oil to get the economy going. And if he can't get that, there's only one other place where he can get that. And that's
Russia.
Russia.
Yeah.
Right? That's what made Imran Khan go there and displease the Americans.
I see.
Look, the West is also, people in the West have also got to realize what what IMF has done to the economies of the third world have left us no choice. Galloping inflation, rising cost of living. There's no real growth in these countries anymore. There's deindustrialization. There's GDP growth certainly, but industrialization, large scale industry is not developing any further. So where are we going? And you're pushing us to the wall. And that's why the ruling class of Pakistan, even the military establishment of Pakistan, is looking for options. They're looking
Yeah.
to China. They're looking to Russia. If American officials are watching, they should know it was the military, not just Imran Khan. It was the military of Pakistan that wanted to get oil and gas from Russia because of what neoliberal policies have done to Pakistan. The military was on board. Of course, when the blowback came, they left Imran Khan out to hang. We say they made him a kurbani ka bakra. We slaughter a goat on Eid. So they left him to be slaughtered, etc. And they said, "Oh
Right.
no, that's not our policy anymore." But the military was on board with respect to that policy. They shifted Imran Khan's visit was going to be 2 months later to Russia. They shifted it 2 months back. He went early to Russia, and then the war broke out, etc. He went early. Why did he go early? And the military said, yes, he went after consulting with us. Why? Because he needs oil. Why does he need oil? Because we can't run the economy without it. And the debt crisis and the way in which neoliberal policies, what they've done to us in the last 20, 30 years, it's destroyed our country.
So,
Destroyed our country.
so the question becomes, I mean, the situation seems ripe for the rise of like leftist parties. um and so my question for you is, I know that you're the leader of a leftist party, which you mentioned a bit. Are there leftist movements and political parties in Pakistan? Are they growing, if they do exist? And like, do you see a potential given the current economic situation for that growth?
Absolutely. And I'd say this about the Pakistani left, and I don't say this about myself, but about the people I work with, that they are very resilient people. They do not give up. They have fought really hard in very difficult circumstances, and they have not given up. And in communities, in trade unions, in villages, etc., everywhere in Pakistan, the left continues to exist. It's not large; it's down to its skeletal size, but it continues to exist. And now the real thing is that the left has got to the Pakistani left, and we're trying to leverage social media. This is actually, sort of where I, played some role, you could say, and others have played a role, is that I was speaking earlier about how it's very difficult to reach out to the millions of people in Pakistan given the small resources that we have. And that's what that's why I think social media has placed a new tool in our arsenal where we can leverage social media to reach out to more people. And we've got to shift the debate now from these questions of religious identity and Shia Sunni conflict and so on and so forth. And we've got to shift the terms of debate to this particular question of what do we do about the economy? And I think that's not a difficult thing to switch because look at the galloping inflation and the rising cost of living. Got to shift that, and we've got to present to the public that the left alone really has the only alternative. Every other political party has come and gone, including the military, and they've all implemented what the IMF has recommended. And we are the only force in the country that's actually advocating for thinking outside of that framework and for thinking outside of neoliberal capitalism. We are the real alternative. If people of Pakistan are looking for an alternative, here it is. It is the left of Pakistan. There are other left wing parties in Pakistan. Mine is, of course, the Workers and Peasants Party. There is also a small party called the Communist Party of Pakistan. There is a new rising student movement in Pakistan called the Khalek movement. There are left wing nationalist forces in Pakistan. Some are very, very strong, like the um, PTM, which is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, very big, strong movement. There are many, many left-wing, left nationalist movements in Sindh. There's the Awami Workers Party. So there are lots, and there may be many. There are many others, of course, which off the top of my head, I will not be able to repeat, but there are many others. Um, so, and these are people who are genuinely connected to the grassroots. They're not just a couple of intellectual groups that we're talking about who just, sort of sit in coffee shops and talk about the good old days. These are people who are in real struggles. So, but the working class itself has got to come alive at some point, because the vanguard, as we like to call it, given that I'm a traditional Marxist intellectual, the organizers can only do so much. It's the mass of the people, when they begin to move, that's when movements emerge. So that's what's got to happen. We've been supporting all sorts of movements, clerical workers and doctors and teachers and professors and bank workers and so on. They've all been on the move. But on a big scale, if the working class of Pakistan begins to move, not for Imran Khan and not for Shehbaz Sharif and not for People's Party, but for themselves, they become a class for themselves. That's, I think, when you'll see real change in Pakistan. And if you continue to have this kind of inflation, that day is not too far away.
Right. And I mean, lastly, at Breakthrough News, we've tried to make sure that as the rest of the media apparatus in the West completely focuses on like what Europeans think about what's happening in Ukraine, I think it's important to note that the majority of the world, even in countries that are very closely aligned with the West, have not taken the kind of one-sided position that we've seen in the West. So I'm just curious what the general sentiment across Pakistan is over what's happening in Ukraine, from the media, from the ruling class, from just people on the street who probably just don't care that much. Like I know in Lebanon, people on the street are kind of like, we have our own issues. I don't have enough room to care about Ukraine right now. But yeah, I'm curious what the general sentiment is there about this war.
Well, I think one of the key turning points as far as Pakistani public opinion about the Western media is concerned was the Gulf War. When the Gulf War occurred, when Iraq was attacked, I think that created that was something that, because it was televised, because everybody saw it, because everybody had empathy for Iraq, the entire Muslim world had empathy for Iraq, although very few people supported Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, but everybody had empathy for Iraq. It was overwhelming. So when the Western media was just going at, sort of supporting it so strongly, it developed a very strong distaste within the Pakistani public, for a distrust, I'd say, for the Western media. Very strong. And the second major factor, of course, is Palestine. Palestine continues to be a situation which people empathize very strongly with the Palestinians and find the Western media to be incredibly biased in this regard. And so they have come to now treat anything that comes out of the West with a very strong degree of skepticism. Whether it's Syria, for example, although there was the hardline Sunni sectarian groups were against Assad, right, even though Assad is secular, but because he's Alawi, and he's Shiite, so they were like, oh, he's Shiite, so, I mean, that's absurd, I know, ridiculous, but the bulk of the population wasn't buying it. Yeah. Similarly, in the case of Libya, Gaddafi no longer has the kind of support that he used to have in the 70s in Pakistan, maybe amongst the older generation who continued to, but amongst the younger crowd, he wasn't really popular anymore. But nonetheless, what happened to when American planes started bombing Libya, everybody just sort of sat back and said, that's not what we want.
Yeah.
So similarly, even with respect to China, now that's a situation in which there would be a high degree of people who would say, we would support the Western media, the narrative with vis-a-vis China. But even there was a high degree of skepticism. Even not just government officials for their own reasons, which had to do with funding, etc., and so on. But even a big part of the public said, maybe this is all just exaggerated, bit not true, etc., etc. There's no basis for saying it, but just the general distrust has become very high. So even with respect to Ukraine, there has been no strong counter narrative in Pakistan, let me tell you, about Ukraine, in the sense that there's nobody who's really sort of very strongly taken the position. Look at Ukrainian nationalism. You look at the growth of NATO, the inclusion of 13 countries. Look at what happened to Russia in the last 20 odd years, its economy, etc. Why did Putin turn against the West when he was so much in favor of the West? X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. But still, there were people who were going to, what's that famous? They were going to online lectures from the United States of American academics who were like Meissner, I think. What is it?
Oh, Mearsheimer, yeah, the sort of realist, John Mearsheimer, yeah.
John Mearsheimer. They were going on. They were looking for, they started looking at his lectures, and they started saying, well, this is a different point of view. So what I'm trying to say is, there has developed. I think the West is not aware how one-sided their media coverage strikes people in the rest of the world. It is so one-sided that sometimes it's really, really, there's no nuance in it. There's no real knowledge of what's going on in these parts of the world. It's very superficial. One can very easily tell how superficial it is. And it leaves you with a very strong distaste. I think even in the Cold War, Rania, I think the Western media coverage was very sophisticated because they had to deal with they were fighting against communists, and the communists were very, skillful in the way in which they presented their views and the way in which they presented their case. Anybody who's read Marx has become skillful just because of how difficult it is to read Marx. But
right.
they were skillful. I mean, they made a case. They made a strong case. So the BBC in turn had to be equally nuanced and skillful and so on. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's become so absurdly one-sided that people who are not necessarily leftists and communists and Marxists, but just intelligent people who want to examine things from all perspectives, find the discourse utterly propagandist. Even people who would say China is being unfair to the Muslims will end up saying there's no doubt that the American media or the Western media is propagandist. Even people who may not disagree with Gaddafi and Assad and Putin and Xi Jinping and whoever else it is that the flavor of the month, the Iranian regime, etc., find the way in which Western media looks at these questions. Iran, for example, right? I'm a Marxist. Obviously, I don't support the regime in Iran, but I rarely ever look at the Western media to try and understand what's going on in Iran, right? Because it's so propagandist, it's so one-sided, it's so simplistic that I feel like I'm watching a Rambo or Rocky movie. I feel like I'm looking at Hollywood. I'm not talking to intelligent people, honestly, So that I think is one of the main things that Western media is really failing to convince people who want to have a more sophisticated analysis of what's going on in the world. I don't think, and I feel yes, absolutely, even people on their side, even people who want to say we condemn Russia for invading Ukraine, nonetheless will absolutely immediately concede that the Western narrative is totally one-sided and totally, propagandist.
And they don't even, the funny thing is they don't even know, I saw a New York Times article in the last couple of days, and it was like the first thing I've seen like this, where they were like, the rest of the world isn't like talking about this problem the same way that we are. And it's like, wow, it took you 2 months to figure that out. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
not, because of how ridiculous
No,
it
they're not.
sounds from your side. Yeah.
I mean, look at India. The best example
Yeah.
of that is in India. India did actually have a very strong counter narrative to what's going on in Russia. And in that, the mainstream media was involved in that. And that wasn't because they're leftist or anti-imperialist or anything. They have strong ties with Russia, but the Indian media was very much saying the narrative is too one-sided. We don't go for it.
Right.
With respect to the Pakistani media, we just pretty much ignored it. We just ignored it. Anyway, Pakistani media tends to be very Pakistani focused. We hardly
Right.
ever look at what's going on in the world.
That makes sense. And also, like, at least something I noticed in Lebanon, at least, is in the general Arab media, which actually has been covering the conflict, is people's eyes just glaze over because they're also in a region where it's been constantly at war in various places. It's like you only have so much bandwidth to watch war zones. And honestly, there was like almost among some people a sense of relief that it's just not happening here. For once, right? Like you see that sentiment. It's like, well, it sucks, but at least it's not happening here just this one time.
There was also another, there was also huge sort of backlash on the way in which the Western media covered the Ukrainian crisis when they said, oh, these Ukrainians, they're blue-eyed, they're fair-skinned, and they're just like us, and it's happening in Europe. How could this be? Oh, you cannot imagine that people who did not care two hoots about Putin or what was going on in Ukraine were just like, what the hell are you talking about?
It's so insulting, and just that racism coming to the fore just shows, because that racism undergirds like Western culture, the Western culture that so many people, sadly, in the developing world tend to gravitate towards because of that cultural hegemony you were talking about earlier. It's like a slap in the face to hear people talk like that when you're like, so I mean, this, I think on so many levels. Yeah, go ahead.
No, also I was going to say, it wasn't just the rhetoric. It was also the fact that they allowed 3 million Ukrainians to come into Europe, and they would not allow, even 1,000 Syrians to come into Poland or whatever.
They're like sending Afghans back to Afghanistan, like, despite the fact that their country is like completely destroyed because of the West. Whereas, your Ukrainians are just like being handed visas like candy. I'm not saying they shouldn't be, but like, at the same time, exactly. On that note, Taimur, I want to thank you for joining me for so long to break all this down for our audience. Can you tell people where they can follow you? I know you have a Twitter account. Maybe perhaps there's other places that you want to shout out while you have the floor.
Thank you, Rania, and I can't thank you enough. Firstly, let me just say that I'm a huge fan of your work and your show. Absolutely, you're one of the big main voices in social media that's speaking up for the third world and speaking up for national liberation movements. And really, you're doing a remarkable job. I've recommended you to my students and friends, and I'm a huge fan. And let me tell you, you have a lot. When I got your text message, I was so excited because you actually have a huge following in Pakistan. You may not know this, but yes, you have a lot in the left in Pakistan. You have a huge following.
That's amazing.
This is a great. Yes. So this is a great feather in my cap that I've been on your show, and I'm very grateful to you for amplifying the voice of the Pakistani left through your program. If your fans and if your followers and people who watch your program would like to follow what's going on in our neck of the woods, they can follow me on TAIMUR_LAAL, Lal, which means red, which is also the name of my band, on Twitter. Or they can follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/LAAL is LAAL. Red is red. Lal is Lal. They can follow me there. I'm also on Instagram under the same thing, that is Taimur_Lal. You can follow me there. And I have a website called LAAL.BAND, which is my band's website. And I have a party website, which is PMKP.PK. So all of those pages you can follow. And I hope to continue to converse with you and continue to converse with your followers and fans and friends and comrades.
You are welcome on at any time. We'll definitely have you back on to talk about more of what's happening in Pakistan and around the region. But also, I should have said, I forgot to mention in the opening that you play the guitar.
I do, yes. I have a band. Yes, I play the guitar. I sing a little bit. I have
like a
band.
leftist. It's like a leftist band.
It's a communist band. Yes, absolutely.
Communist band. That's awesome.
Yes, it's called Red.
We'll have to
it's a popular band. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. It's a popular band. I mean, we did that all to break into the mainstream in Pakistan. Because if we broke into the mainstream with our political message, people would be like, oh, what is this? But this was sort of, the cultural activist work that we did, which people loved and embraced. And it gave us a huge platform and a huge voice through social media mainly, but also in mainstream media. So,
well, I'm so happy to hear that. I'm so happy to hear that. And the next time we have you on, we'll have to get you to bring your guitar.
Absolutely.
And play a little bit for us.
Absolutely. And let me also extend an invitation to you that we would love to have you on some of our programs.
Of course.
To talk to Pakistani comrades, and especially talk to Pakistani women, but other comrades, etc. We would love to have you on some of our programs.
Anytime. Anytime. Of course. We'll have to continue that conversation. But again, thank you so much. And I hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you, Rania.